Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here. I hope you're doing well, and if you're not, I hope you are soon. Okay, today on the Dungeon Dive, we are going to do a review and an overview and a look at Klik's Madness. Klik's Madness is a narrative campaign expansion for HEXplore, the Valley of the Dead King. So longtime viewers of the Dungeon Dive will know that the Valley of the Dead King is my favorite version of HEXplore, and it is one of my top games of all time. Possibly still in my top 10. I haven't done a top 10 in a long time, but it has been there before, and I think it still is. I love this game so much. A big open sandbox hex crawl with tons of encounters and adventure and just all kinds of really cool stuff that I love to see in a board game. The Valley of the Dead King has all of it. And the reason why this is my favorite version of HEXplore is that it is the simplest, it is the most direct, and the most straightforward. Games of HEXplore can become pretty fiddly and can get over encumbered by a whole bunch of stuff. But I think the Valley of the Dead King keeps all of the crunch and all of the kind of nuanced adventure that I like, while keeping things the simplest and the most direct. So at its core, HEXplore, Valley of the Dead King, is not a campaign game. There is not an ongoing story that you are following. Each game, you are controlling a party of adventurers, and you are trying to kill the Dead King. And that's it. It's a zero to hero, one and done game that doesn't have a pre-written narrative. The narrative is found within the players connecting the dots from one encounter to the next. And those are my favorite kinds of adventure and my favorite kinds of dungeon crawl games. Klik's Madness, on the other hand, is a perfect way to add a campaign expansion to a game. And I think the number one reason why is because it is completely optional. So I prefer games without narrative campaigns. I like to kind of make my own story up as I'm going. I like to connect dots between random encounters. I like zero to hero, one and done style games. And I already love the Valley of the Dead King so much. And I was willing to give Klik's Madness a chance because of that, because it just adds another layer onto a game that I already love. And if I didn't like the campaign, then I could just ignore it and go back to playing a game that I already love. So it's kind of a win-win situation. And I think at the end of the day, I realized that Klik's Madness is not my preferred way to experience HEXplore, and I will probably not be returning to Klik's Madness. However, that is not saying anything negative against Klik's Madness, because I think it is incredibly well made, and a lot of people are probably really going to like it, especially when they get that delivery with the recent crowdfund where the new narrative campaign for Forest of Adramon is coming out. I'm sure more people went and bought Klik's Madness. So if you like narrative campaign games, if you like HEXplore, I'm sure you're absolutely going to love these kinds of expansions, because they are very, very well made. And I think they did an amazing job of taking these two kind of different things and combining them together, where one doesn't overshadow the other. They complement each other, they bolster each other, and you really can get lost in the details of this narrative world that the creators have created. So let's take a look here. We'll walk through some of the rules section first. Now, this video is going to be kind of an overview of what you can expect, of my feelings and some of the things that I love. A couple criticisms that I did have. There will only be story spoilers for the prequel, for the prologue chapter. And that's just kind of a short little standalone game that you play before the main game. We're going to go up through the setup for chapter 1, but there will be no story spoilers for chapter 1 or chapters 2, 3, and 4. So you don't need to worry about that. The prequel game, but we will talk a little bit about some of the story there, maybe one interaction in particular, but that is kind of a standalone game, so I really wouldn't worry about it too much. So for those of you who have played HEXplore, you know that the game can already be a little fiddly. The rulebooks for these games can be quite large. The rulebook for Valley of the Dead King is the slimmest, I believe, and it's almost 80 pages, but it is kind of a smaller book here. And also, if you guys remember, for those of you who have played HEXplore before, there is also the storybooks that they made for these in the expansion. And these would allow you to read different stories while you were playing. And I have a feeling that they kind of took this idea and saw what was good about it, saw how this could augment a game while people were playing, to where they could learn about the world, they could learn about the characters and the various NPCs and bosses and items. And they took this and massively expanded it to, I don't know, what is this, 600 pages, almost 500 something pages, and added a whole bunch of game elements to the storybook. And so now we kind of have this super storybook that you read. And that's really what the campaign is. It's this really kind of complex game book layer that is built on top of the foundation of Valley of the Dead King. And because the games of HEXplore, it can be somewhat fiddly with a lot of things to remember, just taken as is. When you add this additional layer, it can add some complexity. It can add some moments or some additional moments where you will be referring to the rules. So just know that going in, it might take some time to get into the flow of things. Now, it doesn't add too much crunch. It doesn't change things too much, but it does add just enough and change just enough to where there will be an additional learning process to incorporating the narrative campaign expansion to your game. If you know how to play Valley of the Dead King, if you know how to play HEXplore already, you're probably like 90% there. So if you got both at the same time and you haven't played either, I would probably recommend playing at least a quick game of Valley of the Dead King before incorporating this, because I could see people quickly getting overwhelmed. However, they write incredible rulebooks. This company is great. I think the rules are great. Everything is well laid out. They tell you everything that you need. And so to get a full experience of Klik's Madness, you would want the base game, you would want the Return to the Valley of the Dead King, the single boxed expansion, and then you would also probably want the living cards or the encounter deck. Now, the only thing that is a requirement is the base box. So if you just have the second edition of the base box, also, I don't believe this will work with the first edition. For those of you who only have the first edition of Valley of the Dead King, I do highly, highly recommend upgrading to the second edition if you can't afford it, just because it's so much nicer. The map tiles are so much better. And a lot of the details that they added to the map tiles are used in this book as points of interest to visit. And so if you have the first edition, I don't think this will work with it. I might be wrong, and if I am wrong, please let me know in the description, and I'll pin, or in the comments, and I'll pin that comment. But you really do, all you need is the core game of Valley of the Dead King, and then anything else you have can augment that and make the experience a little more robust. But it does tell you when it uses something in the book, it does tell you with these icons here exactly where it comes from. So they do a very good job of kind of onboarding you, of going through some of the campaign rules, this little layer of rules that's going to be augmented. It's going to be added to the base game rules for HEXplore, and how those things are changed. The main way that things are changed is you will be keeping track of time by using the power-up deck. And at the beginning of a chapter, you will deal out a certain number of power-up cards. And then depending on the actions that you take during the narrative sections of the game and what you are doing on the map as you are playing, you will flip certain cards over. And then at the end of a whole turn, once all the phases are done, you will flip one card kind of horizontally like this. And then that will represent a day. And so then you might flip some other cards like this, and then another day. So now we're at 2 days. And so there will be certain things that they will ask you, okay, how many days have passed since your last since your last rest, or how many days have passed in the campaign? And that is one of the uses for the timer mechanism in this power deck. Another is a game over trigger. And if you are ever told to advance time and you are out of cards in your timer deck, in your power up deck, then that is a way to trigger a game over. There are ways to add cards to this deck while you are playing. So your deck at the beginning, your timer deck isn't the ultimate. Things can grow, things can get added onto, so you can gain more time while you are playing. And some of the ways to gain more time is to actually engage with the game. I never really felt that the timer, through my playing of the prequel, the prologue, and chapter 1, I never felt like the timer was preventing me from enjoying the game. It was just lighting a little bit of a fire underneath my feet, and it was preventing me from experiencing everything. So it did make it so I had to make some choices to go off on a side quest or not. And that is a kind of timer that I enjoy. I never felt like it was stopping me from doing something, but it was forcing me to make important decisions. And some of those important decisions will come up again later on subsequent replays. So there are some side quests that you probably just won't be able to do because of the time limit, but that will allow you to go back later and then play those different things that you missed. So I think that's pretty cool. Another way that's a little bit different is in how the characters level up, or actually what they have access to at the beginning of the game. So in my games, I played as a Sapphire Golem Brute, and I played as a human priest. And so these were the characters that I played. I played kind of like in a role-playing way where I said my human priest here had kind of put together this brute, almost like a Frankenstein's monster, because it's a golem type thing. And so they were traveling the land together. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the prequel chapter, the prologue, is supposed to be played completely separately from chapter 1. The game does not recommend that you take your characters that you played from the prologue and translate them directly to chapter 1 without doing a little bit of resetting to kind of keep the balance in order, to keep the balance in check. And that's because of the way that the progress is upgraded a little bit. So at the beginning of a game, at the beginning of a campaign, your masteries, your special powers, those are actually going to be locked off and you don't have access to them. Additionally, if you are playing with the traits, which is another little kind of expansion module piece that came with the return of the return to the Valley of the Dead King, if you are playing with any traits, then those are also locked off at the beginning of a campaign. And if you are using any of the aspects that came with the hero chest, and I never bought the hero chest, so I don't even know what the aspects are, but if you are playing with those, just know that at the beginning of a campaign, those aspects are locked off too. You're also locked in how many upgrades you can purchase for your vitals and for your abilities until things progress to a certain point in the campaign. To unlock your masteries, to unlock your abilities, you have to visit certain shrines while you are playing on the map. And each time you visit a shrine, you can choose one thing to unlock. So there is a little bit of a governor on your character progress, and that is basically done to keep kind of the balance in check for an entire campaign, especially for those early moments where things maybe are a little bit easier. So just keep that in mind. It's just a little bit different than you don't have the full freedom of experiencing everything that the game has to offer like you do in the board game right when you start this narrative campaign. So you are kind of restricted a little bit. It still feels kind of like a sandbox, but it's kind of just a smaller, think of it as a smaller sandbox to play in. And you will also be locked in a certain difficulty. For those of you who have played before, where's my battle mat? The battle mat, you could play at certain difficulty levels in the base game, and you could go up whenever you wanted. But in the campaign section, it will tell you at which difficulty you are going to be entering into at that particular chapter. And then the turn sequence is just a little bit different because of how you keep track of time. And you also don't use any of the placards that come with the base game as far as what you can do in the various locations. This book here has the things that you can do, and they're a little bit different. So if you know what you can do in a city, if you know what you can do in a shrine in the base game, that information, this new information, is going to be new things that you can do. And you will be surprised all over again of the kinds of choices that you have access to as you engage with the various locations. Now, one thing I really like is this hexicon. It's a lexicon, it's a glossary, and it has all of your keywords. Super, super handy. Man, they really know how to make things as easy as possible for onboarding into these kind of complex or fiddly adventure games that can sometimes get bogged down with too much information. So the rule book here does have a whole bunch of new adversaries, a whole bunch of new monsters that you are going to face off against. And you will refer to the book. At certain times, you will roll dice. And instead of drawing a card that might represent your shambling zombies or your bandits, you will turn to this book here to face off against your goblin looters or your goblin dungeoneers or your wolf riders. You have monstrous rats, Klik's shaman, the pale orb weavers. And then there are also bosses that are unique to this experience here, to this game here. So you have the hobgoblin bruiser, King Klik's forces, Castronic the bloated. What I was wondering is while I was playing this game is if you could incorporate these enemies and these bosses into a regular game of Klik's Madness, a regular game of Return or Valley of the Dead King. You might be able to. You might be able to make a little chart just to add a little bit of a variety if you're kind of, maybe you're tired of facing off against the same bosses. But just something to keep in mind. And then we get into our creating our hero section. Now, this book does focus on the heroes and the races and the classes from Valley of the Dead King and its expansion. So we have all of those listed here. The reason why that is important is because of these heroic moments. These heroic moments are little narrative snippets that are tailor-made for different combinations of those races, of those aspects, and those roles, the classes. And this is very cool because it does make you feel like if you are playing a brute who is a striker and maybe a golem, you might have a unique encounter somewhere in this book, or maybe multiple unique encounters somewhere in this book, to where that experience is tailor-made for the character that you are playing. That is awesome. I really, really love these heroic moments. They make the choice of what kind of character you are playing really meaningful. And whenever I got to do one of those, and I did get to do it a handful of times in the prologue and in chapter 1, it felt great. It felt like, oh, wow, this is so cool. This is something different that only I am able to experience on this one game. If I was playing with different characters, I would have a very different experience on this one narrative encounter. So that is really, really cool. Just to give a overall example here. So the different roles, we have healers, sappers, assist, striker, and utility. And for each one of those, for the healer, there are 35 unique moments. For the sapper, 35. For the assist, 25. For the striker, 22. For the utility, 22. Depending on how much food, what your food rating is, there are, if you have a 0 or 1 food rating, there are 5 heroic moments. If you have a food rating of 3 or more, there are 12. So you can already see if you really wanted to have a lot of heroic moments, you can make a healer who needed 3 or more food, who was an elemental and a vagabond and maybe angelborn. So if you did all of those, then you would have the most opportunities to have the most heroic moments. And so the ones that I picked, I didn't look at this while I was picking my characters, but I looked at it after, and they were kind of right in the middle. So I figured, okay, I would have a few heroic moments, not the most, not the least. But I think that is really cool. I love that. And then we get into kind of just an overview of how the book is laid out. And then finally, we get into our prologue here. And the prologue map is set up here. One thing I do think is really cool is how the map system is used. So the maps, you never play with a full map. Each chapter takes place in its own little sector of the complete world map. And the complete world map is actually shown in here. Let me see if I can find it. It's not really a spoiler, but you can just see how the world of Valley of the Dead King is kind of imagined by the creators of the game. And you could just set this map up like this to play through your games of Valley of the Dead King. And I think that would be really cool because this is kind of the landmass as created by the creators of the game. And so it kind of makes a geographical sense maybe. But so each chapter, you will be focusing on a different sector of this map. The prologue, you will have this small map here where we have the Shrine of Seasons, and this is where the adventurers start. So at the beginning of the prologue, your adventurers will be in this Shrine of Seasons, and you are trying to investigate something that is going on. Basically, let's read a little bit here so you can get a flavor for the text here. I think it's pretty well written. I would say better writing than a lot of narrative board games. Not as good as a great novel or a great short story, but pretty good. So this says, so this prequel is called Trouble at the Gates. And this says that you have called the Shrine of Seasons your home for all of your lives. The whole of Runecrest Valley lay beneath you, the perils and troubles of the land only drawing your attention when a dedicated traveler conquered the arduous rocky road leading to the shrine's gate. To these travelers, you gave blessings and protection. They, in turn, provided you with news, goods, and occasionally training in their unique trades. A sheltered life can only protect for so long, however. This is the day that the perils come to you. The bell alerting the priests and acolytes of an approaching traveler rings loudly through the early morning fog. You make no quick effort to see the newcomers, even despite such a rare event. That is, until you hear the cries for medical assistance. So that kind of sets up the whole campaign. Your characters are in this Shrine of Seasons, and some news comes to you about these emerging problems with these goblins. And so you have to go out and start investigating the land. And in this prologue chapter, there are two main points of interest you're going to be investigating, and that is the Eastern Ruin and the Western Ruin. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how these maps are used. And I think this is such a cool part of this overall experience. As you guys know, this game has fantastic looking maps. And especially in the second edition and then in the subsequent versions of HEXplore, they have done a great job of adding in all of these great little details, like this shrine or this cave here with a river flowing into it, or this wizard's tower here, some kind of structure there, some ruins there, some kind of like Stonehenge looking structure there. These various shrines. There is on this map tile here, there is a ship out in the water. We have this shrine here, this ruin here, or this kind of a castle built into a mountaintop there. What else do we have? We have a shrine there, some crystal structures. Maybe we have this little structure there, some spider webs scattered around there. What else do we have? Let's see here. I love looking at these maps. There's so much. This little tower here. There's just so much to discover on these maps. And what's really cool is that as you are playing, and I just completely messed up my prologue map. We'll just pretend it's right. Let's see, in and out. But as you are playing, all of those little points of interest, all of those little graphics on the map, there's a really good chance that they have some kind of narrative impact into the game, that you will be able to go to that ship and something will that will trigger a narrative thing about that ship in the narrative campaign while you are playing. So I love that. I think that is really cool. The way that this book makes the board part better, and the way that this board part informs what you read in the book. It's a great marriage of these two different kinds of things that you are experiencing on the tabletop. So each chapter, including the prequel, the prologue here, will have how you set up your map. And then it will tell you to gather certain circumstance cards. And so those are your events. Now, this is one part about this that I'm not thrilled with, is because you will have a really good chance to know what kind of things you will be facing. So you know that in the prologue here that you're going to be facing zombies, bandits, boars, mangy wolves, inclemental weather, pleasant weather, a lucky's rabbit foot, and fisherman's luck. You won't know exactly when you are facing off against these because which one you face off against from one turn to the next is still determined by a roll of a D10 or a D6, I should say. But you do have a good idea of the kinds of threats you are going to be facing. So everything is not a complete surprise. However, each of the chapters does have a circumstances table, and depending on where you are, you will be rolling and having and facing off against a subset of these. However, there are also these ones that are in red that are actually the reds are, let's see. Yes, so there are circumstances that are in bold red font. That means that those are from the book. And so again, it does a really good job of making sure that you don't need to hunt certain things from certain places. Just in the rules, it keeps things moving, and you always know where to look to gather the thing that you need from all of the various components that you have. So that is really important there. But each of the chapters will tell you which things you need from the box, from the board game to play that chapter, which hexes you might need, which maps you might need, which little chits you might need, which cards you might need. Now, one deck of cards that you will never be using is the quest deck. And the quest deck is one of my favorite things in these HEXplore games because these are all of the cool random things that you get to go off questing for and all of the little stories that you get to have. So you will not be using the quest deck, but don't worry about that because what the game book what this is basically a really big glorified quest deck. It's the quest deck made epic because all of these little passages and all of the kinds of little stories that you will be reading are similar to those quests, and they play out in a similar fashion. So you might be told to place a hex here on this tower. When you go to that tower, you will take that hex off, and then you will turn to a triggered event in the rulebook. And that is kind of like drawing a quest card that corresponds to that particular hex. So the kind of stories you are experiencing are a little more directed. So they will make a little bit more sense, a little bit more narrative sense than just having all of these random things happen. So if you like a more directed narrative, I think you'll really appreciate this approach to how quests are handled. There are also elements in the game book parts, the Klik's Madness, where you will have different keywords, and those keywords will trigger certain things while you are reading. And when you get to a certain hex, when you get to a point of interest, that is usually when your attention is drawn from the board game part of the game to the book. And then you turn to the book and you play in the book, and then it'll tell you, okay, this event is now complete. And then you can kind of close the book and then go back to playing the board game. Very rarely do you have to do both at the same time. One thing you do need to keep in mind, though, are these triggered events. So this is kind of another thing that's maybe in the back of your mind the whole time while you are playing, is to make sure that each one of these triggered events, when it happens, that you turn to this book in order to progress the story and in order to do the thing that you need to do. Another pretty interesting thing about kind of an encounter that you can have within the book are with NPCs. And so at one point in the prologue, you will meet this NPC named Thyrillus. And if you choose to join him, he becomes an escort, just like in the base game where you can use him to fight in combat and you want to protect him. But you can join him in a side quest to go off on this completely tangential quest with him to discover more about the world and to possibly get some more treasure. But that is you do have to think about, okay, do I have enough time in my timer deck to participate in that side quest? What's really cool is if you choose to engage with this NPC, Then you turn to the back of the book here, and we go to the NPC section. And I think this is pretty great. So this NPC section here, you have all of the various NPCs that you will meet on your journey. And here we have Theralus. So we get to learn a little bit about him as a character. And then depending on where we meet him, so if we meet him in the prequel or chapter 2, we can ask him these questions. Do we ask him about spider silk? If you fought an undead opponent in the past and speak with him about it, read these particular passages. So each of the various NPCs also has narrative passages that you can engage them with. I think this is pretty neat. I've never seen that before. I like that. It adds a whole nother kind of layer to the game book, the game book mechanisms. But you will be going from one, you'll be reading a few paragraphs, then you'll be playing HEXplore it. Then you'll reach a point of interest on the map, then you'll read a few paragraphs, make some decisions, and then return to the board game. And so that's kind of how the overall flow of that game goes. I think the balance between the two different halves, the game book half and the board game half, is really well maintained. I never felt like the board game was the most important part, or I never felt like the game book part was the most important. Each one of them complements the best parts of each other. And as soon as I was kind of getting tired of reading and wanting to return to the board game, it was over. I think the narrative passages are just long enough to get you into the mood, to get you into the story and into the characters and the setting without becoming overwrought, without needing to read too much, without feeling like, okay, I'm not playing a board game anymore, I'm playing a game book. Or I'm reading a somewhat kind of a mediocre fantasy novel. I never really felt like that while I was playing the prequel or chapter 1. And so the balance is really good. It's kind of amazing what they did. This was such an afterthought. It was maybe 10 years or so after they made this original HEXplore It game. And they came back to it and took a look at all of the stuff they gave us, all of this great sandbox stuff. And they said, how can we use what we gave them, what we gave the players, for them to have this wide open sandbox nature, this wide open sandbox game? How can we modify that to tell a directed story? And they did a really good job. I'm really, really impressed with the work they did. So chapter 1 is really where the game kicks off. Again, it says, while it is not recommended to continue play using the same heroes, you may choose to begin the chapter 1 using the same hero. So they don't, if you take the heroes from the prologue into chapter 1, you do need to reset them a little bit just to keep the balance going. Or I guess you could ignore it and you might have a little bit of a easier time through chapter 1. And I think that's fine, because one element that I think can be an issue with the way that the game book is set up is there are hard endings. There are failure is an option, and that option is game over. So this game does not have a fail forward mechanism. There will be times where if you run out of time or if something happens, it is game over. It is the end, and you lose, and you have to replay that chapter. In order to do so legitimately, you do need to have a saved version of your character at the beginning of that chapter. And to do that, they do recommend going to their website. It's very easy to find, and downloading some of the character sheets. And at the beginning of each chapter, what you should do is transfer all of your information from your placard to that character sheet, so you have a saved version of that character at the beginning of chapter 1, and then one at the beginning of chapter 2, at the beginning of chapter 3, at the beginning of chapter 4, and so on, because that really is the only way to kind of reset the game and go back. So that is a little bit of a disappointment for me, that there is a hard the end, game over, you lost. I would have preferred a fail forward mechanism, but that's just not the way that the game was made. But here we have our map for the things that we will see in chapter 1. And this is really cool here because it shows you where in the world you are playing at. So here we're playing this kind of a central north to central east, northeast region of the overall landmass in Klik's Madness here. And we have our different locations. We have our Dragon Port. We have a couple shrines. So you'll want to visit those shrines in order to unlock some of your masteries or your aspects or your traits. We have these various quest tokens, and here the quest tokens represent reports of goblins that may be associated with the raid on the Baron's estate. Travel to a quest location to unlock triggered events there. So when you go to one of these quest locations, you'll want to look on these triggered events here, this triggered events page, to see which of these triggered events you have unlocked. And then there is also a really nice map key here, just again to make things a little easier so you can very easily keep track of, okay, so I went to quest token 2. So quest token 2 is the southwest of Dragon's Port, quadrant A. If you are here in the event phase, play a circumstance, so have an encounter, and then read a particular location. Here we have all of the rules. Each chapter has some unique rules. So just know that going into the game as well, that when you get to a new chapter, you will have some new things to learn, a few new layers added on top. And then also it'll tell you again which components you need from the box and which boxes, which set, which expansion those cards are in. And then you can go through and play the rest of your chapter and have the rest of your adventure. So keeping track of those triggered events is something that I'm not a huge fan of, but it really is kind of the only way they could have done that. It was something that kind of took me out of the game a couple times because I would forget and then have to go, oh shoot, I should have done this last turn. Let me go back and try it again, or let me go back and kind of like rewind the game a little bit. So if you're playing solo, you'll probably want the book laid out next to you. And then you can just keep this triggered events page handy so you can always check it. It does have good information though. It will tell you, okay, so at sunrise, you will trigger this. During the movement phase, keep track of this. During the skill phase, keep track of this. During the circumstance phase, keep track of this. During the event phase. So this is a whole new layer of stuff that you do need to keep track of. So just keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that the failure is an option, and you'll hit at the end at some point, maybe if you do poorly, and you will have to replay. One thing I think is super cool though is with chapter 1, the win condition is when you are in Dragon's Port and you actually start this chapter in Dragon's Port. The win condition is if you are in Dragon's Port and you wish to end the chapter, do so. Turn to section 1096. And so this still gives you the option of, okay, so you've gone out and explored, and let's say you've gone through, most of your timer deck. You only have a few cards left in your timer deck, but there are some things that you still need to do. But hey, you know what? You know that you need to get back to Dragon's Port in order to end the chapter. So the end of the chapter is up to the players. It's up to them to say, okay, so we've explored enough. Maybe we've powered up enough. We've found some artifacts. We've discovered enough information to progress the story. So let's go back to Dragon's Port and let's choose to end the chapter now rather than maybe face some kind of consequence out in the world where it's going to force us to run out of time and have a game over. So I do really like that. So yeah, all in all, Klik's Madness is very well made. I can't imagine the amount of work that went into this. Just the logistics alone of taking everything from the Valley of the Dead King and incorporating it into this book, of writing this grand story, of having this very complex game book. I didn't run into any game-breaking typos as far as turning to certain sections that were wrong or anything like that. I didn't look at the errata. I'm sure there is some just because of the complex nature of this beast. But overall, so far, I think it's really well made and it's very well implemented. The marriage of board game and game book is fantastic. But at the end of the day, like I said at the beginning of this video, it's just not the way that I like to play HEXplore. If I had the choice, I would never choose to turn to Klik's Madness just because I already like the base game so much as it is. And I like making up my own story by connecting the dots between all of those various quest cards and all of those various consequence cards, all of the random events that make up a game of HEXplore. Those are the things that I like. But if you like a narrative story, if you like something that is more directed, if you want a little more fiction in your board game, I would have a really hard time suggesting something better than Klik's Madness. Probably something like Sleeping Gods is comparable into how the two work together. I would put this at that same kind of level of that same kind of narrative experience that doesn't intrude on the board game experience. The two things are married very well together, and it's very, very well made. Good writing, good art, good documentation. It's clean. It's not frustrating, but just know also that it does add those few layers of fiddliness on top of a game that can already be pretty dang fiddly. So, all right, you guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video on Klik's Madness. This was a game that Dungeon Dive patrons voted for me to cover. And so if you'd like to have a say sometimes in the games that we look at on the channel, you can join the Dungeon Dive patron. I really appreciate the support. It does make things, it does make this channel possible. So, all right, well, have a good one. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.